Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Our research-backed videos are engaging, easy to follow, and they help ease the daily challenges like agitation and anxiety so that you can focus on connection and joy. Available by subscription on mobile and TV apps, Zinnia makes every day a little bit easier. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm, as usual, Steve. Today, we are diving into one of the most famous figures of the Old Testament, King Solomon. Known as a wise ruler, a great builder, and a man of immense wealth, Solomon's story is told in the biblical book of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. But what do we actually know about him from history? That's the question we're going to explore today. Solomon, whose name in Hebrew means peaceful, was also known as Jedediah, meaning beloved of Yahweh, and he was beloved of Yahweh. According to the biblical account, he was the son of King David and Bathsheba, who King David ruled over a united Israelite kingdom. His reign was marked by political power, extensive trade, and military strength, and of course, legendary wisdom. He's credited with writing parts of the biblical books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Wisdom, but his most enduring legacy is his massive monumental building projects, including the grand first temple of Jerusalem, known as Solomon's Temple. But how much of this story is history? I think a lot of the listeners of this podcast would even start thinking, I'm not so sure about this. And we'll talk about how much is tradition that comes from the Bible. So let's so-called dig into the evidence. So what do we actually know about a historical Solomon? So we've talked about Solomon as he appeared in the Bible. He's wise, he's powerful, he's wealthy, he's militarily strong. But what about the historical record? What do we actually know about Solomon from sources outside of the Bible? A lot of scholars would just say, you know what, guys, the Bible is not a historical document. Clearly, the Bible, you pull your Bible off the shelf, it's not reading a history book as we would examine a history book today, but there's definitely chunks of history in there, and it gets to the point of what a people thought about either themselves and their history or what they felt about themselves at that time. But with that being said, things get a little tricky because there's no direct textual evidence even or really direct archaeological evidence from outside of the Bible that confirms Solomon's existence. Unlike other major rulers, we don't have inscriptions or clay tablets of official records from Solomon's time mentioning Solomon by name. That doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't exist, but it does mean we have to rely on some indirect sources and some indirect evidence to build a historical picture of this guy. One of the strongest arguments for Solomon's kingdom being a major regional power comes from archaeology and specifically trade, we have evidence that the kingdom of Judah, which Solomon supposedly ruled over as a part of this united kingdom with the kingdom of Israel, was engaged in long-distance trade with surrounding regions. There's an inscription from the 7th century BC, which would be several centuries after Solomon's supposed reign, which records trade between Judah and the kingdom of Saba in what is now the country of Yemen. In the Bible, Saba, known as Sheba, the kingdom of the famous Queen of Sheba, that is, while it isn't direct proof, like absolute pinpoint proof of Solomon himself, it does suggest that later Judean Judah kings and rulers maintained an economic connection with Arabia, which could have roots in an earlier period, maybe, possibly, kinda. And we can see that these trade routes, it's really how the trade routes operate very much today. Products from the East, now things are coming from China and India and you name it. But then the important, some seriously important products were coming from this Sheba, which is Yemen. And they go up the products would have very easily shipped or straight up the Red Sea to really the southern tip, what we would call from the Bible, Edom, was right there, right smack dab there. And there was also land trade routes that went right into where Judah was. We've talked about this. There's even more evidence when we look at the copper trade. Archaeological digs at Timnah, which was a major copper production site in southern Israel, have uncovered signs of large-scale mining and trade networks. Copper was a key resource in the ancient world, which you mix it with a couple other things, tin, you name it, and you could get bronze, which bronze was the thing that it was kept this whole thing going, the Bronze Age. And if you could control production of copper, you could have a major source of wealth on your hands. Copper wasn't really the limiting agent of bronze. Tin was, and tin was a much more important element to control in that equation. And copper is a little easier to find, but still having solid, easily accessible copper is a big deal. Beyond metals, trade in high-value goods also played a role in Judah's economy. Excavations have revealed evidence of trade in fish, fruit, almonds, and luxurious purple-dyed cloth, items that were expensive and in high demand across the ancient Near East. If Solomon's kingdom really was involved in this kind of commerce, it could have been a very wealthy state. Maybe not quite as wealthy as the Bible describes, but still pretty awful wealthy. Now, Solomon loved him some monumental architecture. What king or medium-sized city mayor, is there really a difference, doesn't love monumental architecture? One of Solomon's most famous accomplishments, at least according to the Bible, was the construction of the first temple of Jerusalem. The biblical description paints a picture of a grand, gold-covered sanctuary built with cedar from Lebanon and adored with intricate carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. But is there any archaeological evidence to directly support this? Unfortunately, the site of the first temple is a major sticking point for historians and archaeologists. The Temple Mount is in Jerusalem, where Solomon's temple would have sat, and it sat basically on top of the second temple, which the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits right on top of. So this makes it really one of the most politically and religiously sensitive and controversial archaeological sites in the world. So that means archaeologists can't just go in there and dig and have large-scale excavations. It's just not possible. So it makes finding direct evidence that much more difficult. The archaeologists are basically sitting on a gold mine that they can't tap into. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
However, there is some indirect evidence that suggests Solomon's temple wasn't entirely out of place for its time. If you remember back a few episodes of the history of the papacy, we discussed some well-adorned and well-attested temples in the ancient Near East, particularly in these areas of southern Anatolia and Syria. The two examples we talked about were the Tel Tayanat temple and the Ain Dara temple. These structures, built around the same general time period as Solomon's supposed reign, shared striking similarities with the biblical description of Solomon's temple, like really close. Beyond temples, there's also some evidence of large-scale construction projects in Judah during this time period. Archaeologists have uncovered fortified cities and defensive structures that align with biblical descriptions of Solomon's monumental building projects. For example, sites like Lachish, one of the key fortress cities of Judah, show evidence of significant construction with massive walls and gate complexes that fit with the idea of a kingdom investing heavily in its defenses. Before we wrap up, there is one more fascinating piece of indirect evidence we should talk about, not from archaeology or from trade records, but from art. In Pompeii, of all places, we find what might be one of the earliest iconographic depictions of a biblical scene, the famous story of Solomon's judgment. Now, this artwork was found in the house of the physician in Pompeii. It appears to depict the well-known story that we all know and love from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 24 through 27. So I'm going to read a little bit of it from the New King James Version. And the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, "Divide the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son, and she said, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child and by no means kill him." But the other said, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." So the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother." This artistic representation raises many questions of this really cool story. Was it inspired by Jewish communities in Pompeii? Was it commissioned by one of the so-called God-fearers who respected Jewish teachings but didn't convert? Or were early Christians involved somehow, some way? The depiction ultimately adds to Solomon's lasting influence, even in this unexpected place. It really, when I started to read about this, it was mind-boggling. It's like, how did they find out about this story? The Greeks were all into it. And what's kind of cool about this is it's kind of a side thing about the icon or picture, you might say, but there was pictures of Socrates and Aristotle, or what many scholars think was a little depictions of them kind of like listening in on what this great Solomon was getting at, which I think is very cool. The way they were depicted is very classically the way Aristotle and Socrates were depicted. What about Plato? I don't know why he doesn't get in the picture, but who knows? So really, to wrap up today's episode, in the end, what can we say about the historical Solomon? We've covered a huge range of evidence regarding Solomon, from biblical traditions to archaeological clues about trade, monumental architecture, and artistic depictions. While there's no direct proof of his existence, the economic and cultural context of his supposed times suggest Judah and maybe a combined Israel was a powerful and wealthy kingdom. Does that necessarily support the biblical account of Solomon, or say that it's the absolute truth and not watered down, or what we might call mythologizing, where later generations would mythologize a known character from their tradition? Were the biblical authors trying to pump up their own past to reflect a present that maybe wasn't so awesome? That is where we get into the trickiness of the Bible. It isn't a historical source in the way modern scholars would view one, but does any ancient writing really represent this ideal? And that's an honest question. My amateur self would say probably not. I'm just looking at this logically and practically speaking, and based on what I know. Most people couldn't read. Fewer people than that could write. And right there, we have a major issue. Writing material was extremely expensive. Writing materials were fragile and are fragile by their nature. What scholars have today as far as writing represents a tiny amount of the small amount of what was written back then and available. The people who were writing were performing an extremely time-intensive and expensive process. Something as precious and expensive as any purple-dyed cloth from the rotten remains of snails, bronze, or almonds, or any of these things that were passing hand to hand in trade back then. I think amateurs and experts alike should keep in mind when drawing conclusions. So with that, we've skipped over much of the biblical account of Solomon. That is an episode and really a series by itself. I bet you our old friend Gil will be on that pretty soon. We've only scratched the surface, but we see the context of Solomon, and a Solomon that could have built a temple that we will discuss in future episodes. I hope you've enjoyed this brief episode, and with that, I hope to see you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes and Christian church.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.